Arcane's episode 3 had a wonderful title, The Base Violence Necessary for Change. It is wonderful, partly because it so aptly encapsulates the high-level thesis of the entire series, and because it makes an interesting argument. The argument, namely, that change is violent. Not only that, but there exists a base violence. In order to change in any significant capacity, there is an underlying baseline of violence that acts like a rite of passage. For those tangentially familiar with general chemistry, an analogy can be made with the concept of an activation energy. An activation energy, as defined by Britannica.com, is the minimum amount of energy that is required to activate atoms or molecules to a condition in which they can undergo chemical transformation. Mapping Arcane's arguments to an activation energy graph, we have the reactants, analogous to the characters, and the activation energy, which is analogous to violence. With the activation energy or baseline violence, you are able to achieve a transition state and undergo change. And although there's no explicit pinpointing of where the baseline is, by the end of Arcane's episode 3, we learned that it is indeed as high as one would think. To go from powder to jinx takes considerable violence. After all, it is a near 360-degree change. Similarly, if one has watched shonen to any degree, the same argument can be extrapolated. For instance, take the ever-so-popular Demon Slayer. In its first episode, titled Cruelty, it makes the same argument as Arcane, although less explicitly. The base violence necessary to propel Tanjiro to change is the death of his entire family. In other words, the base violence is nothing short of cruelty. Vinland Saga is another example. The motivation for Thorfinn to go from this to this is a high baseline of violence. Another common feature is that, whether justly or unjustly, the one experiencing the transformative violence is in part responsible for it. The violence Jinx ultimately underwent was a result of her own actions. Thorfinn's father dies because he hid away on the ship. If we go back to our activation energy example, then self-infliction can be thought of as a catalyst. A catalyst is something that reduces the activation energy. In other words, self-blame can cause you to undergo change with a lower bar for violence. This is why anime protagonists often have such violent pasts. At its core, a story follows the journey of a character's change. In that way, violence is a tool that drives characters past the transition state. This is because violence forces a choice on you, either change or crumble in its wake. It is a barrier that only the strong-willed, ones worth writing stories about, cross.